Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another week of No, It's Not Just the Weather. It's me, Carlota, and I'm here as always with Alfredo and Ada.
Hello.
And today we're talking about climate change and conflict and how it is a two-way relation. But first of all, what is a conflict and what roles do resources, specifically natural resources, play on conflicts? Just to give you some context, there's a lot of debate in academia to define what a conflict is. There are many definitions you can take, but a general and broad definition that we can grab for this episode, for this discussion, would define it as the struggle over values and claims to scarce status, power, and resources. So we already see how a lack of resources comes into play to generate a conflict.
Therefore, if climate change may create scarcity, what are some of the possible consequences? This is one of the topics that we will explore in this episode.
However, can it also be the other way around, that violent conflict has negative consequences that contribute to climate change? How are some ways that this can happen? Is it happening now? Therefore, should anti-militarism and advocating for peace be included among the actions taken to mitigate climate change? Does mitigating climate change mean that we should advocate for anti-militarism and peace? If violent conflict and climate change are deeply interrelated, and as such, this relationship must be considered when approaching both topics.
But firstly, let's establish some important concepts. There are various types of conflict. In this case, we will focus on violent conflict. However, the relationship is not limited to violent conflict and climate change, but approaching all types of conflict would take many more episodes. Well, violent conflicts can be national or international. They oftentimes refer to wars, but not all of them fit exactly the definition of war, especially since the definition of war is not always agreed upon.
Yes, so as we can see, there's a lot of debate and nuances to these conversations. But I think that a good way to start is talking about climate change as a driver for conflict, and especially the Michael Clare hypothesis. This author, in his book Resource Wars, The New Landscape for Global Conflict, tries to incorporate climate change and its consequences to the study of geopolitics, violent conflict, and competition. He argues that various vital natural resources will become scarce due to climate change and population growth. Therefore, he argues that the future geopolitical landscape will be characterized by more numerous and violent conflicts that will be determined by concentrations and the need for vital resources. The need for these vital resources is determined by the necessities for the livelihood of the population as well as economic imperatives. He also adds to this that the prevalence of natural resource-driven conflicts are also linked with aggravating factors, such as weak or corrupt national authorities. Another aggravating factor suggests that this will disproportionately affect poor regions and developing countries, as generally their livelihoods depend more on natural resources and will be more likely to be ultimately forced to migrate. Thus, this follows some of the arguments that we have presented in other episodes, in which climate change is an aggravating factor for various challenges that already exist, like gender inequality, poverty, and many other types of vulnerability. According to this hypothesis, another factor that should be added to the analysis are those more violent and numerous conflicts that will hurt more those already vulnerable places and people, and at the same time create more vulnerabilities.
So, just to highlight one of the examples that the author proposes in his book, focuses on the South China Sea. It's a sea that's bordered by Taiwan, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So it is a vital connection between some of the most important Asian states. And the dispute around this area is complex. It has historically been a major fishing zone, with various countries fighting over fishing rights in its waters. But now it is also a key transit point for various oil shipping routes. However, there are also oil and natural gas reserves below the seabed. As these countries' populations grow, and also their economies, so does their need for energy, with a growing pressure from the international community to phase out oil, sometimes seeing natural gas as a cleaner option. Cleaner, put on quotations, because we've heard in other episodes that it's perhaps not exactly the cleanest of options. Now, various states are competing for islands in this region. as they create exclusive economic zones and gives the rights to explore the seabed. The competition is causing increased confrontation, which threatens to pull China and other Asian countries such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and others, some of these with direct support and even defense treaties with the US, furthering the risk that this competition creates further conflict.
Now, turning around, how can violent conflict be a driver for climate change? Well, firstly, the world's militaries combined would be the fourth largest national emitter, behind only China, the US, and India. According to Kinney, as cited in WILPF from 2023, so it's a very significant impact. We know the consequences of greenhouse gases emissions on climate change, as we went over them in the first few episodes. Moreover, militaries around the world almost completely lack accountability for their environmental impacts. But what is the reason for this? To a very, very large extent, US lobbying during the negotiations for the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. These efforts were successful in there ultimately being no obligations for countries to report military emissions. Therefore, data comes mainly from estimates. Other sources, for example by Ackerman et al. And others, estimate global militaries and arms industries accounted for 5% of the total greenhouse gases emissions in 2017. However, the damage is not limited to greenhouse gas emissions. Military conflicts and other kinds of violent conflicts oftentimes completely devastate the ecosystems of the regions where they take place. This is not new, this is not a new thing. Historically, the burning of enemy crops and fields, poisoning of rivers, among others, have been used as methods to wage war, or sometimes not even as a method of waging war, but as a mean of further damaging, even destroying the group that has been defeated. However, the creation of industrial warfare since the First World War has made the destructive capabilities of war almost endless, and the possibility of nuclear warfare now makes the destructive capabilities of war be total. After all, the concept of mutually assured destruction applies not only to humans. The long-term consequences that the destruction of the environments can have may definitely have an impact that contributes to climate change by various possible means, such as the decreased availability of trees, phytoplankton, algae, and other organisms that capture CO2. However, there is also the aggravating factors. Violent conflicts may hinder the capabilities of humans and ecosystems to adapt to climate change.
Wow, so knowing that there is a clear nexus between climate change and violent conflict, a relation that, as the name of our podcast states, we have shown it is mutually reinforcing, then we must ask what is being done and what else can be done.
Well, one first example of what we want to show you that is being done is advocacy. NGOs, think tanks, even individuals can work towards bringing this relation to the public discourse, trying to bring that to the attention of more people, private operators such as companies and even governments.
One example of this is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, an NGO that, through a feminist perspective, remember our episode on climate change and gender? It analyzes the topic of this episode, how war and climate change both make each other increase. So in a way, through their advocacy, they create a bridge between the topic of the episode that we did on gender and climate change and this one. I thought that was very interesting, and I think that the work they are doing is amazing. So through their research, they attempt to inform and influence people, government, private companies, international organizations, and any public that their message may reach. They also organize trainings, they curate exhibitions, they organize events close or during international negotiations or conferences to advocate for anti-militarism, efforts to protect the environment, and including feminist perspectives to these issues. So we encourage all our listeners to check their website, wilpf.org, or follow their social media and read some of their articles, their publication, and even their guides on some of the actions that everyone can do regarding these topics.
Also, other proposals for actions are the Peace Dividend Campaign or 5% proposal. The Peace Dividend Campaign proposes reducing military spending by 2% each year. Well, and in this case, a group of more than 50 Nobel laureates signed an open letter calling for all countries to cut their military spending. Half of this money, according to this initiative, would be put in an UN fund, the climate change crisis, and other global problems. The 5% proposal is more ambitious, as it proposes 5% cuts every year to military budgets. This idea also intends to dedicate the money saved to alleviating certain other issues, such as world poverty. It intends to be sensitive to certain negative synergies, such as oil and oil-rich countries, militarism, and climate change.
Some of these proposals focus on the feedback mechanism of realist international relations theory, that individual governments face pressure to increase their military spending because others do so as well. This spirals into an arms race with potentially devastating consequences for the environment, the self-fulfilling prophecy. So, these proposals clash with some ideas behind military international organizations or certain defense treaties. Furthermore, it should be asked if this is even realistic. Would governments be willing to reduce their spending on an industry that, according to some of their perspectives, is meant to protect or attain means for their survival? Would it be feasible to expect a government to put that short-term perspective behind and sacrifice some of its wealth and capabilities for a long-term perspective, although maybe not so far away, that prioritizes climate action, the future generations, and protection of the environment? Perhaps the general democratic system that sees an overturning of government every 4 years is, to a large extent, incentivizing governments to prioritize the short-term perspective.
So what else can be done? How do we approach these issues? I think that talking about a military-industrial complex makes it appear too broad. To put it into perspective, I think it is sometimes helpful to think that every bullet is a piece of metal waste, oftentimes metals that pollute and poison organisms, that is released into an ecosystem and left there indefinitely. And any military is a huge industrial complex to levels that are almost difficult to imagine. But every transport, from soldiers being moved to one place to another, or weapons being transported, or supplies being transported, are greenhouse gases that are being released into the atmosphere. Multiply that by the scope and breadth of all the militaries in the world, and you do not even need the numbers to know that this is an issue that cannot be ignored anymore when dealing with climate change.
I think this is a good place to give you our conclusion. And what I want to leave very clear with this episode is that, first of all, climate change does not directly create conflict. There's no evidence to state that, but it is a variable that we need to consider when we're doing research on conflicts. And there's still much more research to be done, but this is definitely, as we have seen, a very interesting conversation and a very interesting topic to dive into.
If you want to learn more about this subject, check out the sources cited in our bio. There are very interesting articles there that you can find. And with that, we finish this episode, as well as the whole season of No, It's Not Just the Weather.
I hope you enjoyed listening to us ramble about very interesting topics and that you learned something new. And thank you so much for tuning in and listening to our episodes. I hope that you are now more aware of the climate crisis we're living in and that you take all this information that you hopefully learned from us and you take it with you to your daily life and as you carry out your day-to-day and spread your knowledge with the world. You can talk to us through our social media at No It's Not Just the Weather. You can also email us at noitsnotjusttheweather@gmail.com. You have all the links in our bio and we hope you enjoy.
Yeah, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.